We will hear the fascinating history of the 3 English country houses where British wireless operators, technicians and code breakers played a significant part in the war effort. We are thrilled to have Roger Yapp with us. Roger is a historian who has put a lot of research and detective work into discovering the story of these Polish code breakers and technicians, and that incredible journey from Eastern Poland through Kazakhstan, Persia, Egypt, South Africa, Scotland, finally 2 villages outside of Hemel Hempstead. The presentation Poles Apart was originally presented as part of the Hertfordshire Association Local History Symposium in November 2020, and has been still growing, as Roger says, since. Roger Yapp is the chairman of the Abbots Langley Local History Society. He has recently retired from his work in IT as program and project manager within financial services, and has put a lot of his passion into pulling together this story. I just wanted to mention a couple of logistics for our proceedings. So the presentation will take around 50 minutes. There will be time for questions and answers afterwards. So if you have a question during the presentation, please put it into the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. In the chat, you can type it in there, and our colleagues will follow the questions and will read them out afterwards for Roger to answer. If you have any general question or a kind of Cressy family general research question, it's probably easier to put it into an email directly to us. Our mics will be off so that we can get the best quality of the presentation that we can. We are recording today's presentation and we will make it available through our website in a week or so. With that, I would like to invite Roger and enjoy the presentation.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Mirka, for a very kind introduction. Our story starts back in 2020, just before COVID, when I was asked by the Hertfordshire Association of Local History to speak at their symposium. The topic of the symposium was a country house at war, and my background from local history has been very much in researching all of the men and women from our local village of Abbots Langley that served during the First World War. So I think that the symposium thought that I would speak on the subject of a country house in Abbots Langley, which there were several where people would have gone to the war or been involved with the war. But I'd been speaking on that subject for probably about 12 years. So I decided to go to a story that, or find out the story of a property in the nearby village of Kings Langley, which I'd been told about some, I don't know, 45, nearly 50 years ago. A house that was called Barnes Lodge, where there were some very strange goings on according to the local people. Well, if I just spend a couple of seconds sharing my screen with you, hopefully you will get my presentation. Let me start this slideshow. Okay, so this is Barnes Lodge as it was in around about 1930. It was, as I say, just outside the village of Kings Langley, which is in Hertfordshire, which we'll come to in a second. And the people in the local area didn't really know what went on there during the war. It was very, very secret, and you'll see as our story progresses that they thought that it was somewhere where secret agents were trained to drop into occupied Europe and help with the various resistance groups and so on. But their story was the story of the Barnes Lodge was very, very different. We've got people from all over the world on today, and many of you may not know where Kings Langley is or Abbots Langley. Well, we are about 20 miles to the northwest of London. Kings Langley at the time was a village in the country. It was approximately, I should think, about 3,000 to 4,000 people during the Second World War. Barnes Lodge is at Red Star, which is about half a mile to the north of northwest of Kings Langley, just south of the town of Hemel Hempstead, which will feature in our talk a bit later. Abbots Langley is an adjoining village to Kings Langley, but I haven't shown that. This is an old map of the area. You see Kings Langley towards the bottom with Barnes Lodge circled in red. The house sat on the top of the west bank of the River Gade. The Gade Valley was quite a communication route from London to the northwest of the country, to Birmingham, to Manchester and on to Glasgow. And you see the A41 road went right through the middle of the valley, the main railway link and the Grand Union Canal along the River Gade. The valley at that point also had several paper mills, John Dickinson's famous paper mills. If you've used Basildon Bond or Croxley script paper, it was probably made in Apsley or in this area. I just point out, just to the above Barnes Lodge, there is a property called Shendish, and the grey area underneath is the Shendish estate, which I will talk about in a minute. This is the entrance to Barnes Lodge. It's off that main road. If you drive past it, you probably miss it. If you walk past it, you probably miss it too. The owners have put the title, the name of the property Barnes Lodge on a placard just behind that tree, which doesn't help. The house is on the top of the valley side, about 400 meters up the valley side. You can't see it from the road. So it was a very, very secret place, and it looks quite spooky to go up there. This is a map from approximately 1890s, which shows the property. You can see where we were at the gatehouse at the top right of the slide. We were looking up the drive there. The drive bends round to Barnes Lodge House with some stables behind. The green area in the middle was originally 2 meadows, but by the time of the Second World War, it was heavily overgrown with brambles and nettles and bushes, which helps to secure the property. You cannot see into the property. I couldn't get a photograph of it in 2020. It's very, very difficult to see it. So it's quite a secret area. The Barnes Lodge started life in the 1820s just as a farm, and it grew in size through the 1830s. By the 1840s, it had a stable block built behind it, and it became quite notorious in the London press because many of the people that were employed in the stables were involved in all sorts of racing scams, horse doping, betting scams, race fixing, all sorts of things. As the century went on, you get to around about the 1870s, 1880s, and the whole of the Barnes Lodge estate here is joined into the Shendish estate, which we saw just as up off the top of this slide. And the Barnes Lodge became occupied by the managers and the managing directors and their families from the Dickinson Empire. When they came into the area, they were put up here until they found somewhere a little bit bigger and better. The property in the early 20th century had changed to look a little bit like this, so not really a farmhouse. And it stayed in private ownership till the 1930s, when 1930, the Shendish estate, together with Barnes Lodge, was sold, and it went into private ownership for people from the local area came to live there. It stayed that way till 1938. A Miss Emily Lindsay bought the property, and she lived there for a short period before war came in 1939, and she handed the Barnes Lodge to the War Ministry for its use for the duration of the war. And initially it was used to house evacuees and also the women from the Women's Land Army who worked on the farms in the local area. In June 1943, the Polish Radio Communications Company arrived and took over Barnes Lodge. So why would the Polish Radio Communications Company come here? Well, there's a story there which I found out. In 1939, as we're all aware, the war started. Poland was invaded. The government and the general headquarters staff of the army eventually came to London via Paris. And they arrived there in the summer of 1940 after France fell. And they were housed in the Rubens Hotel. This hotel is in Victoria, in the centre of London, virtually right next to Buckingham Palace. It's a big hotel, very expensive now. And the Poles were put up in this hotel where I think they lived and they worked there. There were two groups that were set up, very small groups. The Radio Communications Company that sent messages backwards and forwards to the homeland in Poland, and a radio intelligence company which coded those messages and decoded them, and also did some sort of snooping on messages and signals that were going around in Eastern Europe. They were quite small groups, but as the summer progressed in 1940, more and more people, more and more Poles arrived from occupied Europe. The hotel filled, and it became very, very cramped there. So these two radio units decided to leave. The radio reception in the middle of London and transmission was not very good at all. It was very, very difficult to hear messages. And London was being bombed every night, so it was not a good place to be. So they went to a northwest suburb of London called Stanmore, and they took up residence in the Dower House at Stanmore House. It was a house in the grounds of Stanmore House, it's significantly higher than London. Stanmore looks down on London, and they took up their residence and they carried on doing their work here. Now, this is sort of the end December time, November, December of 1940. And then a third group sprung up, a radio research and development group, because they were looking to improve the standard, the quality, the transportability, the ability to conceal radio sets that were being used in occupied Europe, and especially this lot were being used in Poland. So this group started up, and they started with workshops and all sorts of stores, and it just became too many people in the Dower House. So some of the radio group, the Radio Research and Development Group, moved to another house in Stanmore, and a platoon of the Radio Communication Company left the Dower House in December 1942 and arrived at this place called Chipperfield Lodge. Apologies, it's a blurred picture, but it was the only one I could get, and it's probably of the 1960s, but it shows the house more as it was than as it is today. Now, Chipperfield is a village that is about 1.5 miles to the west of King's Langley, so it's all in the area of Barnes Lodge. It had been occupied by an army group, or headquarters of an army group, before the Poles moved in. They moved in, there were 17 of them, and they set up in the fields across the road these great big telegraph or television radio masts, not television, radio masts. Somebody said my talk should really have been called Poles on Poles rather than Poles Apart, but that's another story. The men set these up, and they started transmitting and receiving backwards and forwards to Poland. As part of my sort of research for this, I sort of disappeared down my first rabbit hole. Where were these poles and where was Chipperfield Lodge? Well, at the time I was reading the Norman Davies's book, Rising 44, about the Warsaw Uprising. And the first chapter of that book is devoted to Barnes Lodge. And he talks about Chipperfield Lodge being on a road called Tower Hill in the village of Chipperfield. Well, when I went further into this, well, the big house on Tower Hill is Chipperfield House, not Chipperfield Lodge. So I spent probably about 2 months trying to find out where this field would have been, were there any remnants of the aerials, which I didn't think there would be, and where was Chipperfield Lodge. And a good friend of mine from the History Society, who had contacts in Chipperfield, spoke to a man called Terry Simmons, who was probably in his 90s by that time, and he said, well, Chipperfield Lodge is on the road out to King's Langley, and it's not Chipperfield House. The aerials were in the field opposite. There were 4 of them. He even drew me a little sketch of what they looked like. And he said, well, I recall there was a shed there. He said, there may have been more sheds, but it's a long, long time since I've been there. So they probably contained some equipment. And these sheds were, in fact, mentioned in Norman Davies's book. So Stephen and I, this was the year of COVID, but between the lockdowns, Stephen and I went up to Chipperfield. So you can see King's Langley there on the right-hand side, Chipperfield village about 1.5 miles away. Barnes Lodge circled in red at the top. Chipperfield House is on the left-hand side, circled in blue. It's the road in front of it is Tower Hill, and it is the highest point in Chipperfield, so it's a very logical place to have put the aerials. The aerials were put in the field opposite the light blue circle right in the middle of the slide, where it says Whippendale Bottom. That is Chipperfield Lodge on the road out to King's Langley. Stephen and I arrived at the inn, which is the Two Brewers, the local pub in the area, restaurant. We walked across a long-standing path through the fields to where we thought we might find the aerials, where the red cross is, or the sheds where the brown arrow is. This is a photograph on it. It was a blazing hot day for England in June 2020, the end of June 2020. We walked along the path on the right-hand side. You can't really see it, but I've indicated where it is. We looked across to see if we could find anything of the radio mast, but it was impossible because the whole area was knee-deep in crops, and we weren't going to go and tread them down. In the distance, you can see the Bedmond television mast, and this serves a lot of southeast of England. So you can, that's a place called Bedmond, which is across the Gade Valley, maybe 2 miles away. So this is a very good place to site aerials. So to put the radio masts there was a good place. It would be able to get right way across East Anglia and the North Sea. We walked down behind that big bush to where we thought were the sheds were, the generator building that Norman Davies talks about. And we were absolutely astounded. In the bushes, we found this building on the top left. The windows smashed in, the trees coming through the roof. It's exactly as Norman Davies told us in the book. There was the entrance door, which we had to beat down the nettles and the brambles to get the door open. Went in, the equipment desks are just as Norman described them, with places for the batteries underneath. The generator base is still there with metal rings to hold this generator that would be clicking and clanking and belching out smoke and creating power for the transmission. There was the distribution boards on the right-hand side, and so we've found this. Now, people walking their dogs must walk 20 30 feet from the front of these doors. You can see the path just under the word entrance door. So they walk past and probably think it's just farm buildings. After one of my talks, I think it was at Sarat, a man came up to me and afterwards he sent me these aerial photographs of the area in 1945. The RAF had flown over taking photographs, and you can clearly see the generator building in the middle of the fields and building 1 and building 2. Neither of those are there now. And it's a Google map on the right hand side. So there's confirmation that there were more than one building there. We walked down the rest of the path down to Chipperfield Lodge, and then we had some notes that were provided by Andrew and Mary Nobbs, who are the Chipperfield historians. They'd interviewed a man called Kazik Sitkowski, from a Polish man who came out to Chipperfield Lodge with the first 17 technicians. They'd interviewed him in 1990 as a part of an oral history project for Chipperfield. I think he lived in Abbots Langley at the time. And he said the men came out, they set up the aerials. The Chipperfield Lodge comprised bedrooms, offices, workshops, storerooms, kitchens, a recreation room. And they worked there for a few months, sending and receiving messages backwards and forwards from Poland, and also maintaining the 4 masts that they'd erected. He said the food was very, very good there. They integrated well with the people of Chipperfield. And he said, but when the deputy chef was on and the food wasn't so good, they would take the walk that Stephen and I had taken back to the 2 brewers where they had their lunch. And that's exactly what we did on that hot day. So back to our friends down in the Dower House. Well, in June of 1943, the whole of the radio communications company leaves the Dower House and comes to Barnes Lodge. They lay cables across the fields from Barnes Lodge to Chipperfield Lodge. Didn't bury them, they laid them across the top of the fields. They brought back all of the transmission and receiving equipment and put it into the lodge, and all of the transmissions were done from here. They laid teleprinter lines back to London, and they started work. At the same time, the Radio Intelligence Company left the Dower House and went to a place called Boxmoor, which is it's a suburb of Hemel Hempstead, but it didn't say exactly where they went in Boxmoor. Here's some photographs of a photograph of the radio telegraph operators. There were around about 50 of them worked at Barnes Lodge, and there were approximately 100 people worked here and at Chipperfield. There were the operators, there were administrative office staff, there were 5 female teleprinter operators, there were the officers, there were the kitchen staff, there were guards, and so on. There was about 100 people, and engineers to look after all of the equipment and the cables and the masts. So around about 100 people, mainly Poles, that were working at Barnes Lodge. Now, I'm really indebted to 2 people for this part of my talk, because this man here, Franek Rymazuski, with a question mark next to him, because he wrote an archive which was available on his website, and he'd been in correspondence with the Chipperfield historians, and they put me onto his website, and I've got a lot of information from there. But we don't know whether this is Franek, so that's why the question mark's there. And another man called Czeslaw Zygmunt, and Czeslaw wrote some articles in the 1990s in the Watford Observer about Barnes Lodge. They said that the work there, they worked 8 hours on a shift, and they would be having the rest of the time to themselves, except when there was a lot of issues going on in the war, I guess, a lot of that needed much more much more effort from these people. There was a lot of traffic going backwards and forwards. So for those times, they'd be working 20 hours, and they would be working with their headsets on for 15 of those hours. And Franek says it was really very, very hard work. They had to concentrate very, very hard. The messages were coming in code, in Morse code. They were coming with Morse code, but they were encrypted in code, and the messages they sent were coded. So they didn't know what they were sending or they received. Said that the life there was relatively easy from a military point of view. There was not a lot of the parades and making sure everything was clean and tidy. He said you were expected to do your job and to do your job very well and to keep your mouth shut. Around about 40 of the people that that 100 that I mentioned lived in Barnes Lodge in very cramped conditions, and the rest lived out in the local community. And we have some letters from people in the local community really praising how well the Poles integrated with the local Kings Langley community. They obviously missed their families, but they loved the children in the area. Some of them were superb artists, others were great singers, and there was a great sort of love of this group that were around the area. But the one thing that people didn't know was that they didn't know what these people did when they went to work each day. They kept completely silent about it. So, what did they do when they weren't working? Well, off duty, Franek said that they slept a lot. They caught up with their sleep. They bought or borrowed local bicycles and they toured the local area. At least 3 of them married into local families, and they would go down to nearby Hemel Hempstead, and they would go to the Oddfellows Arms. The bottom right picture shows it in the early part of the 20th century. The top left as it is now, it's still there. After they'd had a drink, they would go to the Apsley Village Hall, to the local dances there on a Saturday night. In fact, there were dances nearly every night of the week, I understand. And the girls from the Dickinson's factories would be their partners. And they would go to the cinema, the Luxor in Hemel Hempstead, or on occasions they would catch the train and they would get tickets to go to the theatre down in London. Now, Franek Rymaszewski, as I say, he has had an extensive archive, and his story, I believe, would be fairly resonant. Would resonate with many of the Poles that would be at Barnes Lodge, and probably with the families of many of the people that are on the call today. He was born in Pinsk in eastern Poland in 1923. And here's his family: 4 brothers, mother and father. His father was a manager in the General Post Office at Pinsk. And in February 1940, he was arrested by the NKVD and never ever heard of again. His mother, Franek, and his younger brother, Zibzek, who is haloed with the yellow halo, were arrested in April 1940, and they were deported to work in the collective farms in Kazakhstan. And Edek, his elder brother, and Zygmunt, his elder brother as well, they were arrested later in 1940 and sent to the gulags. So these are pictures from Franek's archive. I don't believe they are Franek, but they're symbolic of what happened. He traveled for 2 weeks on the cattle trains across Russia and Kazakhstan to Arak-Balyak, where he worked on collective farms with his mother and his younger brother for about 18 months. We move on to the war. Doesn't go that well for Russia. Their friendship with Germany dissolves when the Germans invade Russia, and relations between Russia and Poland change. I mean, this is quite a complex story, and I'm not going to go into it. I'm going to skim over it quite quickly. But a General Anders from the Polish army had been captured in September, I think, 1939 and imprisoned in Moscow. And he is released to form a Polish army to fight alongside the Russians. And suddenly, men and women are being released from prison camps, from the gulags, from the collective farms. And Franek joins up on the 1st of February 1942. He leaves his mother and his younger brother at the farm. And on the 26th of February 1942, he arrives in Lugovoy, in Kazakhstan. Now, this is sort of a Google map. It's not very, very accurate. It sort of shows some of the key places, but obviously the roads, it shows the roads on there, and not always were the roads used, as we'll get to. Relations break down between Russia and the Polish army, the Anders army, which is growing by the day, and they're sort of more or less left in limbo in Kazakhstan. And eventually, I believe it's the British come in and negotiate and say, can we have this army to protect the Persian oil wells, because the Germans are swarming across southern Europe with their eyes to getting their hands on the oil in Iran or Persia. So the Anders is asked to get his army out of Russia, which is a whole story in its own right. They cross the Caspian Sea, they don't go around it on the road. And there's one of the freighters. Many people die en route. And about 120,000 people, about 80,000 of them are serviceable age, and the others are families and children and older people, arrive in Iran. Franek he comes to Palestine, where he's trained as a radio operator, and he becomes a very, very good radio operator. Many of the families go down into East Africa, to India, and so on. Many of the men and women of serviceable age join the British and Allied forces and fight across North Africa and Italy. But Franek takes a boat all the way from Cairo around South Africa and ends up in Scotland in 1943 in September, where the first person, one of the first people he meets, is his brother Edward, who has escaped from, well, not escaped, but left the gulags and arrived via the similar route in Scotland a few months before. To sort of tie up what happened to the family, well, the younger brother Zibzek, who went with him and his mother to Arak Balyak, leaves in spring 1943 because I believe he's conscripted into the Russian army. And the last that's heard of him, his mother gets a message after the war from the Red Cross to say that he was wounded in Budapest in 1945. So we believe that that's probably where he died. He's never heard of again. And Zygmunt left the Vorkuta Gulag in April 1941, joined up with Anders' army and ends up in Guzar. He's very, very frail, and sadly he dies in Guzar in June 1942. So now we go back to Czeslaw Zygmunt. Now in his articles, Czeslaw said that when he's working at Barnes Lodge, I forgot to say that after Franek met his brother, he was eventually sent to Barnes Lodge in 1943. Czeslaw starts talking about one day when he's working, he's joined by a man who's living in digs in a nearby village of Bovingdon, a man called Henryk Zagalski. And Henryk Zagalski is living in these digs with another man called Marian Rajewski, and the both of them are members of this Polish radio intelligence group that had come out to this place called Boxmoor. And I heard these names and I wondered where I'd heard them before. So these are the two men. and they are very famous indeed, because in the 1930s, along with another man called Jerzy Rzycki and other Polish students and code breakers, they broke the Enigma code in Poland several times. And just before the Second World War, the British and the French made a couple of trips to Poland where they met the Polish code breakers. Information and Enigma machines were handed over just before war broke out. Now the Poles left Poland, and with the route through Romania, they escaped from Poland, and they got to Bucharest. Marian Rejewski took upon himself to go into the British embassy and ask if they could get them to Britain. But the embassy really didn't know who he was, and they said, "Oh, we haven't really got time to talk to you. We're really very busy." So he went across the road to the French embassy, and they made a few phone calls, and they called a man called Gustave Bertrand, who was the head of the French code breakers, and he arranged for this group of code breakers to get to France to work in Paris. And they eventually got to Bois-Vignon in Paris, outside of Paris. It was the French sort of equivalent of Bletchley Park, I guess. Gustave Bertrand down there at the bottom, he was the head of the code breakers. They worked there with French code breakers, working on Enigma codes and Spanish code breakers, until in June 1940, France fell, and Gustave Bertrand spirited his code breakers away to a chateau, Fours, in southern France, in Vichy, France, which was not controlled by the Germans. And the code breakers all worked in this very remote chateau there. The Poles also made trips backwards and forwards to North Africa, to Algeria, where the French had code breaking facilities. And on one of the trips back, Jerzy Rzycki's ship sinks, and sadly he loses his life. Well, in November 1942, the Germans decide to occupy the whole of Vichy, France. So the code breakers scatter, and Rejewski and Zygalski are taken by the French resistance across the Pyrenees into Spain. Another whole story in its own right, phenomenal story. When they get there, the resistance more or less hand them over to the Spanish authorities, who imprison them for 3 months. And eventually, with the help, I think, of the British authorities, they are got out of jail and sent to England, where they are immediately recruited into the Polish army. Now, this place, Boxmoor, was the second rabbit hole that I had to dive down to try to find out where these code breakers and radio intelligence company was working, because if you live in the local area, everybody knows where Boxmoor is. It's a suburb of Hemel Hempstead, but where in Boxmoor were they working? Where was their Barnes Lodge as such? And a good friend of mine was doing some research. This same man, Stephen Danzig, he was doing some work to try to find German prisoner of war camps in Hertfordshire, of which there were a few. And he came on Camp 235, the Archies at Feldon. And this is a clip from the website he was on, and you immediately see some things. There's in the centre, in circle, is Boxmoor House. Well, the station next to it, there's a railway line there, is Boxmoor Station. The village, which is just off the top of the slide, is Boxmoor Village. That's the suburb. If you read the blurb, I'm not going to read it all, but it mentions the Polish Radio Intelligence Company, and it mentions a house called Widgeons in Streethanger Lane. And I suppose the giveaway is that there is a plaque which is on the side of the house, or the front of the house, which commemorates Rejewski and Zygalski. So the red arrow on the map is Widgeons, and I think at this point I thought I had found my equivalent of Barnes Lodge for the radio intelligence group. So I made an appointment, and I visited the house for a whole afternoon. A couple, Mr. and Mrs. Mills Webb, invited me, and I spent the afternoon with them. They'd moved in the 1980s, and I said to them, well, have you had anybody else come to your house to talk about code breaking and whatever else? And she said, oh yes, we've had quite a few, but nobody for about the last 15 years or so. You know, you're the last one, or the first one for many, many years. And they started talking about a man called Martin Harradine, who was a local policeman in the village of Boxmoor. And subsequent to this, they told me the story of Martin, but when I started to research this, I got in touch with the Decorum Heritage Trust, which is our sort of local museum in Hemel Hempstead area. And eventually they got back to me and they said, oh, there's a man called Malcolm Harradine who's recently died, and his family have deposited his archive with us. So I went to the trust, and I spent an afternoon looking through his archive. So the next bit of the story is from Malcolm's viewpoint. He'd read a book in the 1980s by a man called Gordon Welchman, and it was the first book, one of the first books probably, or the first book that was published about Bletchley Park. And Welchman was a colleague of Alan Turing, the famous codebreaker there. And he read this book, and it mentioned Marcin Rzucki and Ulrich Zagalski living in a property in Boxmoor, but they didn't say where. So he got in touch with Bletchley Park because he thought they might know, and they said, well, sorry, we don't know anything, but we'll keep your name on file. And then he wrote to the publishers, and after a couple of months, the publishers came back and they said, well, we've got in touch with some people. Yeah, they lived in a place called Bargrove Avenue, and it was a bungalow. So being a local policeman, he went on his beat and he walked around Boxmoor, and lo and behold, in Bargrove Avenue, there is only one bungalow, and it's number 17. And this must be a picture from the 80s or the early 90s that he took, that was in his archive, the top left. The bottom right shows it from Google Maps as it is today, and a sort of extension put onto the front of it. So whilst he knew where they lived, he still didn't know where they worked. Where were the rest of the radio intelligence company? And around this time, there was a lady, and he mentions in his archive, a lady called Eugenie Maresch from the Polish Heritage Society, was trying to write the history of the radio telecommunications company, or the radio communications company. And she had hit all the blocks that I'd hit, and all the blocks that Malcolm had hit. And she wrote to Bletchley Park, and they said, well, sorry, we don't know anything, but we know of a man called Malcolm Harradine who's been investigated. So he put the two of them together. And as I understand it, Eugenie then came up with some people from the Polish community that had worked in the radio intelligence unit. And together with Malcolm, they all met up in Hemel Hempstead. They went for lunch in a pub at the White Horse, and they turned up for an afternoon and an evening and a late early morning with the Mills Webbs at the house which is in Felden, not Boxmoor, which was the Widgeons. And Mr. Mills Webb said that they came back several times after that, and each time they arrived after a boozy lunch, and they went at about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, having eaten and drunk everything that the Mills Webbs had in the house. But they were a great crowd to work with, he said. So gradually, more and more of the story starts to come out. Now, this is the house again. The Poles were able to tell the Mills Webbs that, and Malcolm Harradine, that they built, again, 8-meter tall radio masts just off the top of the slide. There's an area called Roughdown Common, which is just off the top of the slide, and it's a similar height to the masts that were at Chipperfield. There was about 60 people working in this house, and the house to the left, or to the right, if we're in the house off the left of the slide, which was called Windy Sails. 60 people worked here, basically code breaking. He said that the two poles that we were following, Rajewski worked in, and Zagalski worked in this room that's built on the front of the house, which I've called the cipher room. They both had small teams. Rajewski worked cracking for him, very simple German police and SS codes. And it was like, it was nothing for him after Enigma. Very simple stuff. Zagalski was working with the British MI6, the Secret Service, and they were snooping on Russian transmissions from the Eastern Front. And Zagalski was cracking the codes, the Russian codes for them. So even before the Cold War started, the British Bletchley Park were snooping on Russian transmissions. So these two men were working here. This is the inside of that room. It's one of the rooms that they've kept very much. It's very much their lounge now, but it's the inside. So there would be 6 or 7 or 8 Poles working in this room. When I spoke to Mr. and Mrs. Millswebb, they mentioned that when they first moved into the house in the 1980s, they would look out of their bedroom window, and there would be these dry patches, regular dry patches on the lawn in their back garden, and they had no idea what had been there or why they were dry patches. And then the gardener started to dig up and find in all the flower beds these sort of concrete blocks, and they didn't know what those were either. And then their central heating went wrong, and Mr. Millswebb asked for a plumber. A plumber arrived, and he went up. The boiler was in the loft of the house, and the plumber came down. He said, well, I fixed your central heating problem. He said, but the boiler you've got up there is enormous for a house of this size. And the house is quite a big house. But he said it would serve a small holiday camp. And then the gardener arrived and said, well, he found some pipes that ran down the side of the house. They didn't know where they'd come from, but they went under the ground and into the garden. So they had all these questions. Well, as I say, Malcolm and Eugenie arrived a few times with the Poles, and this is from Malcolm's archive, and it's one of the pictures of the Poles in the back garden of the house. As you can see, it's quite a big house. Where that arrow is pointing is where the pipes were running. They didn't come from anywhere, but they ran along that side of the house and disappeared into the garden. Here's another picture of the group there. I think it's Mrs. Millswebb on the left. There's a man holding an envelope, and in the envelope was a plan that had been drawn by one of the Poles that had worked at the Arches or the Widgeons, and he drew the house. So when we look at this, it answers many of the questions. The remains of the pipe work was along the side of the house. He draws a shower and bath block at the back of the house, which is built later, but after the Poles moved in, and it's not there. They were demolished at the end of the war and taken away, and just garden restored. Also, there were 2 Nissen huts in the back garden. So the pipework joins the boiler to the baths and the showers, and the concrete blocks were what they were underneath the huts, keeping them off the ground. So this came from Malcolm's archive, which shows that there were, in fact, by the end of the war, 3 Nissen huts in the back garden. They're not great photographs, but they are the best we've got. So there were three Nissen huts there. So what happened to these buildings after the war? Well, the Poles left in 1945, and Barnes Lodge was looked at by several companies, but Glaxo, the pharmaceutical company, looked at it to try and make it into a research and development office, but they didn't take it on. And eventually it became a school. Up until about 1975, when the school left, and it was just used for storage. And then eventually it was bought privately. The old house was demolished and a new house built on exactly the footprint. But I think not sure that, I think the front maybe was round the side, but maybe not. But it's a different house, but it's now occupied. Widgeons, as it was called, Widgeons Rest, in the 1940s, became the Arches. And I think it became the Arches because you can see across the front door there is an arch being built on that little roof there. Above the roof is the plaque commemorating Majewski and Zagalski. The Poles left here in 1945, and it was reoccupied by the administrative company of a German and Italian prisoner of war camp. Hence the information that Stephen Danzig found. The camp on the map is the blue arrow at the bottom left at the place called Howe's Retreat. So that's where the camp were, where the German prisoners were and the Italian prisoners. And the Windy Sails is sorry, you can see Widgeons Rest with the yellow arrow. See Roughdown Common above where the aerials were, and Windy Sails next door. As I say, from about 1947, the property went back into private ownership, and eventually the Mills Webbs bought it in the 1980s. Franek Rymazuski and his brother Edek left the army in 1945 and remained in England. His family had disappeared in Poland and the country was occupied still, so he didn't really want to go back, I don't believe. He found it very difficult to get work, to live, but the two of them lived in a small bedsit flat in London. And I believe he undertook some training to become an architect, and eventually worked for the George Wimpey, I think they're international, building construction company. He spent time in Canada, spent time in London, and eventually went to live with his, I believe, his family out in Australia. And he had a website that was, when I was looking at it, was still accessible in around about 2020, but I haven't been able to get to the full website since. So maybe the family have taken it down. He would be 100 this year, and maybe he's passed on, I don't know. He had an interesting note in his archive about his mother, Alexandra. She returned to Poland. She was repatriated after the war, and he found her name on a list of displaced persons. And he paid for a young lad who spoke perfect German to go back to Poland and bring her through the absolute carnage of displaced people and of what Northern Europe must have been in 1946 and 47, with the world being, and all the boundaries being redrawn. But this boy brought her back, and she lived the rest of her life in London. And that would be a wonderful story if anybody has any more information about that. Henryk Zagalski, he left the army in 45, and he went to work at Battersea Technical College, where he was a mathematics lecturer, which became Surrey University of Surrey, and he stayed there for the rest of his career. He returned to the property in Bovingdon. When he first met Czesław Zygmunt, he was living with Marian Rajewski in digs in this village of Bovingdon. And this is the house where they lived, Green Hallows, rather large house, and that's as it is today. He lived there with Mr. and Mrs. Blowfield. Mr. Blowfield died in 1947, and he continued to live there with Bertha Blowfield until 1960s. So I guess that the two of them were really partners, because they moved away in the 1960s down to Hampshire, and bought a house in Hampshire. He must have retired by this time, and sadly he died in August 1978, and Bertha died the very next month. And in his probate, everything is left to Bertha. So I think that they married, maybe they married, I don't know, but they certainly lived together for several years. Marian Rejewski returned to Poland, was constantly hassled by the secret police who wanted to know more about what happened at Bletchley Park. But although he'd spoken to people at Bletchley Park in the 1930s, he dealt and sent messages and received messages backwards and forwards by a little van that used to turn up at Feldon. He had never been to Bletchley Park, and he couldn't answer really any of their questions. I think they were really just harassing him. He went to work in industry. His story became a little bit better known in the late 1970s, and he died in 1980. And before he died, he made statements that he thought that if he and Zagalski had been allowed to go to Bletchley Park, it would have made significant difference to the war effort, but they weren't allowed to go there. And this really sums up the situation with that. Gordon Welchman, who was one of Alan Turing's colleagues, a code breaker in his own right, who wrote the book in the 1980s, the Hut 6 story, the one that Malcolm Harradine had read. He writes, when two of the Polish team eventually arrived here in 1943, instead of being allowed to join Bletchley Park's Enigma team, they were assigned to a tiny unit of Boxmoor, a scandalous example of using racehorses to pull carts. And I would completely agree with that. So, we come to the end of my story. As I said at the start, I'm a local historian. My background is First World War history. I came upon a story from something that somebody told me 45, 50 years ago. And it's become virtually a voyage of discovery and a great detective story. I said I kept on disappearing down rabbit holes, and gradually we've pieced together this story. Now, the story of Barnes Lodge is not that well known in our local area. Many people don't even know where the place is. The property in Boxmoor, I would say, is completely unknown, and the story of Feldon is known by very, very few people. So I've given this talk, I think, about 13, 14 times to local groups, all in our local area. So I think that it's the story of Barnes Lodge. The polls in Hertfordshire is now much better. These are some of the people, or all of the people that I can thank for helping me with this journey. And thank you very much for listening to me. And if you have any questions, then I'll try and answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger.
Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic. Let's have a look if we have any questions that are already there, or if anybody would like to ask a question, please type it into our chat feature and we will try to pick them all up.
Okay, there's one question so far.
The one about, are these people that informed the West about the Warsaw uprisings?
Yeah.
Yeah, they are. Norman Davis's book starts at Barnes Lodge with a chapter about Barnes Lodge where he describes it in great detail. The first messages that I think were received, certainly one of the the one 1944, the Rising 44, the messages arrived unencrypted at Barnes Lodge and caused some concern, because messages should have been encrypted, so nobody really knew, I think, whether they were a hoax or what. But that was the flavour of the first chapter of the book. So yes, the messages were there. Maybe nothing was done about them because they didn't come encrypted, and they thought somebody must have captured a radio and just sent the messages unencrypted. So yeah. Okay.
Okay, somebody else has asked, is there any chance of a blue plaque?
A blue plaque. That's a good point. I had a slide. I've got a longer talk, and I've got a talk. When I did the first talk, the talk was very much the Hertfordshire Association wanted much more information about the history of the properties, and as you can see, they want the end of my talk ends with country houses at war, because I think I over delivered to them. They asked me for one country house, and I told them about 3. There is a plaque, but it's a Polish Heritage Society plaque. I think if we go back to, I don't think it's that easy. Let's just go back and look. When you look at it isn't an official blue plaque. It's there, but it's a plaque which I think it was a big event. I think it was the Polish ambassador unveiled it, and there was 50 or 60 people turned up from various Polish communities in, I don't know when it was, 2016 or somewhere around there. So Arthur Mills Webbs were there, but it's not the official blue plaque. But the other thing that's come out of this is the building that is in Chipperfield, the generator room. And once I gave the talk in Chipperfield, there was a flurry of information on the local Facebook pages where people were asking if that building could become a listed building, a grade 2 listed building, so it could never be demolished. And I've spoken to the farmer. I mean, not on this subject, but I've spoken to the farmer once when we went to look at walk the ground, and he said, well, he's not going to do anything with that piece of ground. It's just been there. It's been there since he's farmed it since 1953. So he said, I'm not planning on knocking it down, but nature might do. But I don't know. I've made some inquiries. I know the parish council in Abbots Langley, but Chipperfield is a completely different sort of electoral area, so I don't know anybody there. And when I sort of pushed back and said, well, does anybody in Chipperfield like to take up this? There was silence, but so a blue plaque would be great. I'm not sure how you go about getting a blue plaque, but yes, a blue plaque would be great, and I'm sure the Mills Webbs would love one there, or and underneath their one on the top of the house. They're very, very supportive of anything that is associated with this story. So very easy to talk to.
Yeah,
so yeah.
Zimbowski says he was present at the unveiling of that plaque carrying a standard.
Excellent. In my other talk, he's probably in one of the pictures, but I took it out really to try to get this to 50 minutes and give you a little bit more about the Russian side. So, but yeah, that's great. And there were probably other people. I mean, the group that came, the pictures in Malcolm Harradine's archive. I mean, I don't know who any of the people are in that, which some of your community might be able to help with. But anyway.
Okay, a couple of other questions. Piotr has asked, do we know why the Poles were not allowed to work at Bletchley?
Yeah, well, several reasons possibly. And I heard Dermot Turing, the nephew of Sir Alan Turing, speak at the Oxford Union, and he was asked the same question. And he said, well, firstly, people thought that because it was 1943 and they'd left Poland in 1939, it would be 4 years. They would be 4 years out of date with working with Enigma, which is complete rubbish because they'd worked with Enigma with the French in right up until November 1942. And these people were some of the greatest mathematicians in the world. They'd cracked the Enigma code, I don't know how many times in the 1930s. And I don't think it would have taken them very long if they'd have gone to Bletchley Park for somebody to say, well, this is what's happened in the last 18 months, and can you help us? And they would have been really helpful. The other story is that there was associated with the first one was that a lot of the people that had worked at Bletchley Park that they had personally met in 1939 had moved on. So there was a complete new management team there. But they did know Turing, and he was still there. They also thought that because they'd spent 3 months in a Spanish prison, and they'd trekked across occupied Europe, and that the Spanish prisons were very much controlled by the sort of influence by the Nazi influence in Spain, and they thought that they might have been got at whilst they were in prison, and maybe their families were being held to ransom back in Poland, and maybe they'd been turned, and maybe they would be double agents or something like that, so they didn't let them go there. But Dermot Turing, he just summed it up, and he said, "But it was quite simple. They were Poles. They arrived in England, and they were recruited into the Polish army immediately. And the Polish army's code breaking was done at Feldon, at the Widgeons. So you go there, and that was just an order. So you can make your choice which one you think is the right one. But Turing said it was the last one. They were just ordered to work where all the Poles are working. But as Welchman said at the end of my talk, it was like using thoroughbred racehorses to pull carts. So,
okay, another question from Russell says, do you know some of the accomplishments of the decoders at Barnes Lodge, and who did they actually work for? In other words, who was paying them and paying for the house and facilities?
At Barnes Lodge, I mean, it was the Polish army. They were officers or privates in the Polish army. So it would be they were Polish army. I don't know what they found, and they didn't know either, you see, because they just received it in Morse code or sent it in Morse code. So they didn't know what they'd found or what they were sending. It went somewhere else to be decoded.
Right.
So there may have been some brilliant achievements or things that I think a lot of it was that the Polish government and the Polish headquarters staff of the army wanted to keep in touch with the home army back in Poland, whether they were giving them things to do or they were finding out what was happening on the front. There was that communication, and there was another one of these bases like Barnes Lodge that was set up in Brindisi in Italy, because the transmissions from Brindisi to Poland was an easier route than from UK to Poland. It was a bit nearer, but I would have thought it would have to go over the Dolomites and all sorts of things. But anyway, there was a Polish station in Brindisi, and it all triangulates with Barnes Lodge and Rubens Hotel and so on. So,
okay, a couple of questions from Marek. He says, did the aerials from Chipperfield move to Barnes Lodge in June 43, or did they remain at Chipperfield for use by somebody else?
They remained at Chipperfield. They laid cables from Barnes Lodge across the fields to Chipperfield Lodge, and then probably under the road to where the aerials were. So the all that Chipperfield Lodge was used for after whenever it was June 1943, whereas it previously been used for a bit of transmission and reception. It was just used to make there were a few people there to maintain the aerials and the generator room and that sort of thing. After the war, the aerials were taken down very, very quickly, and as I say, I spoke to the farmer who's farmed the lands, or he and his father has farmed the land since 1953, and there's no trace of them. There's no concrete bases or anything like that. The aerials were taken down after the war, and that chap Terry Simmons said that there was a shortage of wood. Everything was rationed in England after the Second World War, and the aerials were wood. They were taken down, chopped up, and used as floorboards in the houses that were across the road where Chipperfield Lodge is. So they're there somewhere. People don't even know that.
Right. And then he says, other than Morse code, were any of the messages spoken verbally?
I don't believe so, no.
And then he says, you credited the late Mr. Shimashko. I see the sketch map was signed by him. Did you have meetings with him as he worked in Barnes Lodge?
No, not at all. That's to say, that chap there that had the envelope, he brought, I believe he brought the map from that gentleman, who presumably for one reason or another, he couldn't make any of the trips back to Feldon. But that chap, I don't know who he was, because I wondered if he was the man. But the man that you're talking about, he has written several little pieces that I'd written. I mean, he draws a big sort of network of how the Polish stations were all connected to one another. So I guessed he had a fairly good understanding of it. But it's great to know that he actually worked there. So that's good. And does anybody know if anybody that worked there is still alive? It's probably not, but you know, it would be great to see that. To find out anything, or if anybody has anything to add to the story, or even to correct the story, because as I say, I'm not a Polish historian. I fell upon the story and it became like a never-ending voyage of discovery for me, and I'm glad I did.
Katrina Logan says her cousin from Launceston, Tasmania, worked as a code breaker in England.
Right.
We don't know if he was local or where he was. I don't know if she's still on the call.
I think that would be the only place where they were code breaking, because you know it's where Zagalski ended up. It was the Polish sort of centre. I think they broke other codes that were there, but some of, you know, there's different levels of codes. The German police and the SS codes were coded, but they weren't Enigma level of code. They were, you know, they were difficult to read, but if you were at the level that these two guys were at, it was like falling off a log. And so, yeah.
I'm not sure there's any more questions. There's a couple of comments. There's lots of people thanking you.
I think there was one again from Katrina. She asks, is there any hope of preservation or renovation of the generator building?
Well, there is, I guess, if somebody gets behind it. You know, it's as I say, I haven't really got any contacts with the authorities in Chipperfield. I mean, Chipperfield is a parish council. They would work under the Coreham District Council, and I'm not sure where you would even start to get a building well preserved or listed, you know, so it can't be knocked down or altered. But you know, I don't know if it's something, you know, is there a Polish heritage group that might be interested? You see, because hardly anybody even knew it was there. Well, I didn't know it was there, and you know, I doubt very much whether the people that went to Feldon or back to Barnes Lodge ever went back to Chipperfield. I know that the groups that went back to the Feldon, the Arches, did make a trip to Barnes Lodge, maybe once to see Barnes Lodge, but I doubt very much whether they went to Chipperfield Lodge, because and I haven't really made contact with the people in Chipperfield Lodge to go in there. But so it's something. I mean, I'm quite happy to get involved, but I think it needs, whoever put up the plaque for Rajewski and Zagalski might be the body that would be preferential body to move that forward, because they do that sort of thing, don't they? They work with plaques and remembrance and commemoration, and the Polish ambassador and all those sorts of things. Whereas me going to the local council saying I'd like to do this doesn't count for very much. So, and I mean, I'm quite happy to get involved if anybody wants to pick it up as a crusade. But it's a sad thing. I mean, the trees are overtaking it, but it's not really. There was a tiny bit of graffiti in there, but when we got there, you couldn't get the door open because you had to stamp all the nettles down. So it wasn't being used all the time. But I should think that some of the youngsters of Chipperfield, it's possibly a little bit far out for them to walk. Yeah, but it is sort of very secluded. But 20, 30 people probably walk past it every day with their dogs. So, but the farmer's got no plans to knock it down. As I said, if anybody wants to come out to Chipperfield, Kings Langley, I don't mind taking them around one day and showing them these places. But, anyway, good.
Great, thank you.
It would be interesting.
Yeah.
Are these all the questions, Eva?
I think so.
I think so, yeah. There's a couple of sort of comments. Malik says that Mr. Shimashko is indeed a well-known and interesting historian on these themes. As you say, he has published and was cited by Norman Davies in Uprising. Died, I believe, in early 2020.
And a lot of very complimentary comments from people to say it's been a pleasure to hear all this information, and thank you very much, Roger.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I feel quite honoured.
It's very interesting. And
Yeah.
I might take you up on the tour of Chipperfield.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's all in a local area. You could probably do the whole thing in a morning. But I've yet to go back to the Mills Webs and say, we've done all these talks, because I'm sure they would be happy to host some more polls. I don't know the people in Chipperfield Lodge, but I have got a contact at Barnes Lodge. But Barnes Lodge, as I say, has been completely rebuilt, but the property is there, and it's a spooky way to go into it, and it's very, very difficult to see it from the road, or it certainly was during the Second World War. In that meadow area that I showed you was completely strung with barbed wire, and people just couldn't get through it. So it's good.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Roger. And
Okay.
I have in no doubt expect some visitors. We may be organizing a lunch there to follow up your talk. This was fascinating, and I'm sure there will be some more comments. If anybody has any more, reflections or questions, please feel free to send an email directly to us. We had people from 14 countries actually register for this talk today, and I do realize that in some locations the time zone challenge did not probably allow them to sign in for the talk itself, but we hope a lot of people will be able to capture it and view it when we make it available, probably in a couple of weeks, through our website. I just wanted to mention also that on our website, there are still some of our previous webinars available, and particularly through the Heritage Days in 2021, we recorded 2 webinars specifically addressing the issues of researching your family history and looking in the kind of sources of information about deportations, about Polish Kresy before the war and about the fate of people who went through this enormous experience. So please look it up if it could be of help to you or anybody you know who is currently researching. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Roger, for putting together this enormous detective work that is probably never ending. So we look forward to hearing more. Thank you, everybody on our group who helped set it up and run it today. Thanks everyone who joined us, and I hope to see you again either in one of our future online events or in person at one of our casual gatherings that we organize at the Polish Centre in Hammersmith in London at least 2 or 3 times a year. So see you hopefully soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.